What's the plan? I want to bring in MS Now's Jackie Alemany at the White House. Kevin Fry is on Capitol Hill. MS Now political contributor Mark Leibovich is staff writer for The Atlantic and author of the book, Thank You for Your Servitude. And with me here in studio is columnist and geopolitical analyst Bobby Ghosh. It's great to see you, Bobby. Do you think that the reason that lawmakers are not getting a clear picture, Republicans and Democrats, of what the plan is here, what the end game is here, is because for some reason the White House wants to be secretive, or they just don't know the answer?
Well, they're both the most charitable interpretation possible, that they're deliberately creating this fog of war to keep the enemy guessing. But that is the sort of mixed messages is much more consistent with the White House's behavior on all kinds of things, not just this war. So I lean more towards the latter interpretation, that basically the White House is making stuff up as it goes along, and sometimes changing courses several times a day, sometimes changing course in the middle of a press conference, as we just heard from the president. I don't think there is a clear idea yet in the White House about what the end state is. Never mind how we're going to get out of the war. What is it that we want from this war? That should not be a national secret. That's not something in wars throughout history. The leaders of both sides, especially the side that commenced the war, tend to have clarity and clearly state what their objectives are. This administration has not even stated the objective. So if you're not clear about what you want out of this war, then you're literally going to have to make stuff up. And I think that's what we're seeing take place.
Yeah, it's hard to get from point A to point B if you don't know where point B is,
exactly
right? So, Kevin, if Republicans want more answers, is there anything they can do to force the issue?
Yeah, I mean, they do have some tools in their toolbox, but it's worth noting that it's not just the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee. His Senate counterpart within the last day has gone so far as to say that he could understand why his House compatriot feels the way he does about the administration not being forthcoming enough as to what the steps are. There is a small but rather vocal group of Republicans who are basically saying we need more information, especially if ground troops are going to be involved. Here's some of what we heard from Senator John Kennedy kind of speaking about the dynamics of these briefings earlier this morning.
Are you satisfied with the amount of information that you were getting from top Pentagon officials?
No, but members of Congress would always like more. What I would like to have is another briefing by Rubio, Hegseth, Radcliffe, and General Kane.
What questions do you still have?
The other briefings we have are pretty worthless. I mean, they just send middle-level people from the department over to read prepared texts. I don't even go to them anymore.
And as he alluded to there, he would like to essentially hear from cabinet-level officials. He believes that's more useful in terms of actually getting information out of the administration. But in terms of the levers that now that these lawmakers can pull at, there are kind of two key avenues if they want to try to put any leverage on the administration to provide greater detail about what the end game is here. One of them, of course, is they could vote to rein in the president's war authority by voting for a war powers resolution. Democrats are promising to continue to bring them up in coming weeks, but of course they have failed, with Republicans largely in opposition to them. The other option, of course, is this $200 billion package of additional funding that the Defense Department is floating that they need. You've heard from several Republicans who, one, might be a little skeptical about that price tag, but also, at the very least, would like to see a public hearing so they can understand exactly what the scope is of what the administration is looking for. But again, I want to emphasize this is a small but vocal group that is making these sorts of claims. When I've been talking to other Republicans over the last couple of days, one thing you keep hearing when you ask them, okay, what about the idea of going on the ground, sending in a small limited force? What does that look like? Would you be okay to do that? Would the president be able to do that unilaterally? They go back to repeatedly this idea of it depends. What does it look like? And quite frankly, if the administration is not providing those answers, they don't have a lot of clarity on that front.
Yeah. So, Mark, there are obviously two big buckets here, right? One is the cost in terms of lives, in terms of $200 billion, et cetera, et cetera. Then there's the political cost. And I wonder, politically speaking, do you think this administration, or more likely, I guess, his party, will pay a price for keeping the American people as well as lawmakers in the dark?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of the larger problem. I mean, the lack of information is just sort of what we're seeing, or what we're seeing them sort of awkwardly try to dance around in the day to day. But I also think, look, this war is not popular. And also when you sort of add that to the mounting unpopularity around a lot of the Republican and administration policies around whether it's ICE, around whether it's not dealing with affordability and economic issues that he got elected on, it becomes a real sort of pile of distraction. And when you sort of add to that the uncertainty of whatever it is that's going on here, and it's clear that, you know, these briefers they're not liars, but they're not trying to lie because just for the sake of it. I mean, they don't really have a lot of information either to share or even coming from, I think, the president himself to share. So I just think it's just a big pile of confusion that continues to play out in a way that just adds, as you get closer and closer to the midterms, to a lot of anxiety around Republicans on the Hill you talk to.
And Bobby, when you listen to both the president and Pete Hegseth in particular, they believe the confusion is caused by the media. They believe they've been perfectly clear about their plan and how they're going to achieve it. In fact, we just heard that from Pete Hegseth. Let's take a listen.
President Trump has given us a clear mission. Our capabilities are only going up and Iran's are plummeting. We are here to win, and we're full speed ahead.
I wanted to play that sound because you just wrote about the parallels with the Iraq War. We all know the famous, or I should say infamous, there's the picture of George W. Bush declaring mission accomplished. Do you see similarities?
Well, I see similarities only to the extent that America is involved in a war in a region that it does not fully understand. That's where the similarities end. The Bush administration spent a lot of time communicating what its end objectives were. That too was a war based on a lie, but at least there was a serious effort to describe to the Americans, to describe to the wider world what the objectives were. The objectives were to make sure to remove weapons of mass destruction, which turned out Saddam Hussein didn't have, but also to introduce democracy into a very difficult part of the Middle East, which kind of happened, but not quite. But the messaging was very clear. The Bush administration rallied 40 countries in a coalition to go into Iraq. What you're seeing now is just loose talk about we will achieve victory. We're on our way to winning. What does that mean? What does winning look like? If you don't define what the end goal is, what that does is it allows you to fudge along the way. So you can declare, if you haven't defined victory, you can declare victory at any stage, and you can say, well, this is where we were intending to get to all along, and now we're done and we can walk away. The trouble is that it's a part of the world where those kinds of plans have a tendency to crumble when they meet the realities on the ground. And it's not just about Americans paying more gas or paying more for food and fertilizer, but it's the whole world that is now being held hostage by this war. The whole region, many of our allies in the region, but the wider world. There are countries as far away as the Philippines and Bangladesh, and that are running out of gas, that are running out of oil, and you know, it affects America's image across the globe, it's not just a matter of domestic politics or domestic economics.
So that finally just wrapped up, I think, 2 hours, maybe in 10 minutes into that cabinet meeting. But Jackie, what more did we hear today about where the war goes from here?
Yeah, Chris, and that actually is not the record for cabinet meetings, as our producer reminded me this morning. That is actually the record was held for a cabinet meeting last year that took 3 hours. That being said, we heard all of Trump and his cabinet secretaries touting complete success with this operation so far, that the Iranian military capabilities have been obliterated and that the regime has been defeated. Of course, while Trump and his secretaries have been claiming this, Iran has meanwhile continued to successfully throughout the day today launched missiles that have reached Israel. You heard from Steve Witkoff, that's the lead U.S. envoy who has been involved with these negotiations with Tehran, especially in the lead up to the war, along with Jared Kushner, who essentially confirmed that there have been back-channel diplomatic efforts that have taken place through Pakistan with the relaying of a 15-point plan. We still do not know the actual details in that plan. We know some of the general contours there, that the U.S. is still asking for Iran to give up their nuclear enrichment and capabilities, have no nuclear weapons, allowing for Pete Hegseth also called for 3 different conditions to be reached, which include limits on the missile capabilities that Iran has at the moment. And Trump said that he was confident in the success of these back-channel diplomatic talks and had confidence in the interlocutors based on a gift that he finally revealed today had been received by the U.S. And he cited that there were 8 oil tankers that were allowed through the Strait of Hormuz, again, pointing to that as the potential for some negotiations to progress here. That being said, there's still a lot of mixed messages when it comes to whether or not these diplomatic talks succeed, as the U.S. has at this point deployed nearly 50,000 American troops, and Trump did not answer any questions with regards to what those troops are doing there and whether or not they'll be boots on the ground.
Jackie Alemany, Kevin Fry, Mark Leibovich, and Bobby Ghosh, thank you all.